The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $185 on a cold, clear October morning in 2006 at the Potlatch Lumber Surplus Equipment Yard, outside Sandpoint, Idaho, and the heavy man in the red suspendered logger's coat let out a deep belly laugh that bounced off the timber piles and turned the heads of every Bonner County chainsaw mechanic along the fence. Buford Crane, known across the Potlatch Panhandle cruise as Buff, was 52, 6'2", and 280 pounds of heavy logger frame, dark beard streaked with gray clipped close around a heavy double-chin jawline, sharp pale blue eyes pouched in weatherburn, a deep red windburn across his cheeks and nose, an oily charcoal gray wool toque pulled low. He wore a heavy red and black buffalo plaid wool logger's coat, unbuttoned over a faded gray heavy twill work shirt, dark gray heavy twill work pants held up with thick red leather logger's suspenders, scuffed brown leather cork boots laced halfway up the shin with steel caulks on the soles, and a thick brown logger's belt with a heavy brass potlatch pine tree buckle. A brass-tipped chainsaw round file in a leather sheath hung from a clip at his right hip. He had been camp boss of Potlatch's Bonner County logging operations for 16 years. The surplus auction had been called for the Lake Pend Oreille mill yard to clear the back lot of equipment Potlatch had inherited from a small wrecker operator who had run on Potlatch contract until his rollover. The 1951 Dodge Power Wagon B3 wrecker at the back of the lot had been on Potlatch's books since the rollover, and Buff had told the auctioneer privately he would have hauled the Power Wagon down to the company crusher in Lewiston for the cost of the diesel. The 24-year-old shop mechanic in the deeply faded sage-green wool stagger coat at the back of the bidder's line had just outbid him for $185 against Buff's casual $40 opening shot, and Buff was making sure the Bonner County Panhandle mechanics understood the joke. Boone Whitlock folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his stagger coat and walked through the cold gravel to the truck. The Dodge B3 Power Wagon was 16 feet of military-derived 1-ton 4x4 iron. The cab faded Forest Service green, oxidized to chalky moss green along the body panels and rust brown along the lower door edges. The chrome Dodge letters across the hood tarnished. The heavy round chrome side mount mirrors snapped at the brackets. The small hand-built single-mast wrecker boom listing 2 degrees right, with the frayed cable wrapped around a hand-cranked single-drum winch. The wooden bed planks rotted, 3 of the 4 flat-load NDT tires flat. The word junk spray-painted in flaking timber blaze orange block letters across the driver's door. Boone had grown up 4 miles north of where this truck had last been parked, on a ridge above the South Fork of the Pack River. His grandfather, Tucker Whitlock, was waiting at the trailer. Tucker was 78, a retired Potlatch lumber timber cruiser who had walked Bonner County ridges for 41 years between Sandpoint and Clark Fork. 5'10", lean and erect, with the cruiser's long stride frame and a slight stoop, snow-white hair under a deep wool-felt Mackinaw cap pulled low, a thick white mustache, deep-set hazel blue eyes in a face lined by panhandle wind, a chainsaw scar across his right cheek from a 1971 limb kickback, large knotted hands. A short-stemmed briar pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a deep red and black buffalo plaid wool Mackinaw coat, buttoned to the throat, over a faded gray heavy twill work shirt, dark gray heavy twill work pants held up with thick brown leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather Pacific Northwest logger boots with low heels, and a heavy brown leather logger's belt with a small chained est-wing axe-edge protector clipped at the right hip and a worn brass buckle stamped with a small white pine silhouette. Tucker set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted fender and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Roscoe Belden's old Power Wagon." Roscoe Belden had run Belden Backwoods-Recovery out of a small log frame shop on Highway 200 outside Hope, Idaho, from 1972 until the rollover, working the steep, wet panhandle switchbacks of Cabinet Gorge Pass and the muddy Pack River logging roads, pulling stuck potlatch log haulers off back grades and overturned mill supply trucks out of the wet October switchbacks. He had built the small hand-built single-mast boom onto the Power Wagon's rear bed himself in 1975 with a stick welder he had inherited from his own father Gunnar. He had married a Bonners Ferry girl named Adele Mortensen in 1973, and they had a daughter Junebug, born in 1976. Roscoe had died in October of 1989. He had been pulling a stuck potlatch log hauler off the backside of Cabinet Gorge Pass in a wet October sleet when his own Power Wagon caught a thin glaze of ice on the steep switchback and slid over the shoulder and rolled twice down a 100-foot embankment. He had died at the scene of a broken neck. He was 45 years old. Junebug was 13. The Power Wagon had been recovered up out of the embankment by another wrecker out of Bonners Ferry and parked behind the small log frame shop on Highway 200. Adele had paid the property tax for 9 years until she remarried in 1998 and moved to Coeur d'Alene. The lot was let go to Potlatch in 2001 since its back-abutted Potlatch timberland. The truck had sat in the back of the Lake Pend Oreille mill yard for 5 more years until Buff Crane signed off on the surplus auction. Boone had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a Clark Fork mill truck driver that Roscoe Belden's truck was finally being sold. They winched the Power Wagon onto Boone's borrowed gooseneck trailer. Buff Crane stood at the side of the chain link in his red suspended logger's coat and watched, the chainsaw file swinging from his belt clip, and as Boone pulled out, he called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, Potlatch would haul the Power Wagon down to Lewiston for the cost of the diesel. Boone did not answer. Tucker climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 12 miles north up US 95 to Tucker's red cedar timber frame shop above the South Fork of the Pack River. The dead Power Wagon rocking behind them on the salted highway, the small single-mast boom pointing at the cold gray October Idaho sky like a bent finger. The restoration would take 18 years. Nobody knew that on the drive north. Boone worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Sandpoint during the week and drove 15 minutes up US 95 to Tucker's shop every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab roof because Tucker insisted. The military spec 20-gauge cab roof had 2 small punctures from the rollover, and they cut and welded fresh patches over a slow weekend. They pulled the Dodge 230 cubic inch flathead inline 6 and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 4-speed manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long panhandle winter went into the engine and into stories about Roscoe Belden. Tucker told Boone about the night in 1978 when Roscoe pulled a Bonner County milk truck out of a Pack River Creek crossing at -12 and refused payment, except for a wheel of cured Bonner's Fairy cheddar. He told Boone about the morning in 1982 when Roscoe hauled a snapped D8 out of a Pack River bog above Hope and let the contractor pay him in seasoned lodgepole pine. He told stories about Adele Belden's huckleberry jam. The second year, they sandblasted the salt-rusted frame down to clean steel. By the fourth year, the cab came off. In the sixth year, Tucker slowed. He had a small stroke in late January and was in the Bonner General Hospital in Sandpoint for 10 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hand still worked. He told Boone the truck would wait. By the 8th year, she was a roller. In the 10th year, Boone's son was born, and the work paused for a month. By the 13th year, Tucker sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding chair beside the wood stove. Mackinaw pulled low, the briar pipe between his teeth, and pointed at what to do next. Through all those years, Buff Crane drove past the foot of Tucker's gravel drive on US 95 in his potlatch issue forest green Ford F350 with the potlatch white pine decal on the side door, the chainsaw file swinging from his belt clip through the open window. The F350 always slowed at the bottom of the drive, but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the Power Wagon was painted. They had wet sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Forest Service green that matched a faded snapshot Tucker had of the truck from 1976. And they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking timber blaze orange junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Boone did not know why. He just left it. By the 17th year, the small boom was rebuilt with a fresh aircraft-grade cable. By the 18th year, the Power Wagon was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the steel battery box from under the bench seat for fresh battery posts. The battery box was the last thing on the list because Tucker always said you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what gives her spark. On a cold, clear morning of October the 11th of the 18th year, Boone pulled into Tucker's red cedar timber frame shop with a fresh 6-volt military spec battery and a wire brush. He was 42 years old. The dark brown at his temples had gone steady silver, the small white scar across his right wrist from a creeper jack handle in 2014 was a thin line, and his hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Tucker was 96. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the shop wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the deep wool-felt Mackinaw cap pulled low, the short-stem briar pipe between his teeth, his hands resting on his thighs. Boone pulled the heavy steel battery box up out of its underseat mount and set it on the workbench. He started to wire brush the inside of the box for the fresh battery, and he stopped. The bottom of the box was thicker than it should have been. He measured it with calipers. The factory drawing called for an 8-gauge steel floor, and the box floor was reading at 3/8 of an inch. He took a small ball-peen hammer and tapped the bottom, and it rang hollow. He set down the wire brush. He took an angle grinder fitted with a thin cut-off wheel and cut a careful, slow seam along the four sides where a hand-welded steel false bottom had been fitted inside the original box floor. The false bottom plate lifted out of the box in his hands. Inside the shallow compartment between the false bottom and the original box floor, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed butcher paper, bound with brown twine, was a small flat oilcloth bundle. He carried the bundle to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and cut the twine and unfolded the oilcloth 2 layers deep. Inside were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 60 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $1,200. There was a small brass timber cruiser's caliper with thin engraved bark thickness markings along the inner jaws and the words POTLATCH LUMBER CO. / Timber Cruising Division / 1937 stamped across the brass face above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 6 in a knit toque sitting on a dock railing at Lake Pend Oreille with a small rainbow trout in her lap. The date, August 1982, written on the back in pencil, and there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded, but legible. Boone unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful, and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated October the 11th of 1989. It read, "To Junebug, the cash is for whatever a young woman needs when she leaves the panhandle. The caliper is your grandfather Gunnar's. He cruised Potlatch timber from 1929 until he retired in 1964, and he gave the caliper to me on my 18th birthday in 1962. The photograph is of you, the morning your grandfather walked you down to the lake to teach you how to bring a fish in. I am welding these inside the battery box because the wet October sleet on Cabinet Gorge has been heavy this week, and I do not want them lost if anything happens at the backside of the pass. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Roscoe Gunnar Belden, Hope, Idaho, October 11th, 1989. Boone sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Tucker held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Roscoe wrote this 5 days before he slid over the shoulder on Cabinet Gorge." The girl never knew. They drove south to Coeur d'Alene the next Saturday. Tucker had called a Clark Fork mill truck driver whose nephew guided fly fishing trips on the St. Joe River, and the nephew had given them a current address for Junebug Belden Mortensen on a small log frame guidehouse north of Coeur d'Alene Lake. They drove down US 95 under a clear, cold blue Idaho morning and pulled into a long gravel drive past tall ponderosa pine and stopped in front of a small cedar-shake log frame house with a hand-painted wooden sign reading Belden Mortensen Fly Fishing Guide Service. The woman who came out of the cabin in a green canvas guide coat was 47 years old. She had Roscoe Belden's broad shoulders and her father's deep hazel blue eyes. She wore a faded forest green Filson tin cloth guide coat open over a dark indigo cotton work shirt, faded slate gray wading trousers tucked into scuffed brown leather Pacific Northwest logger boots, a thin silver rainbow trout pendant on a leather cord at her throat, and a thin silver wedding band on her left ring finger. Tucker spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his Power Wagon in my shop in 1984. My grandson here bought the B3 at the Potlatch Surplus Auction over in Sandpoint 18 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded inside her battery box that belongs to you." Junebug's face changed. She brought them into a small cabin kitchen, and they sat at a round oak table, and Boone set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the caliper, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Junebug picked up the brass caliper. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the stamp on the brass face. She said her grandfather Gunnar had cruised potlatch timber along the Pack River for 35 years, that the family had been told the caliper had been sold to a Spokane antique dealer in 1970 after Gunnar died, and that she had been looking through potlatch retiree estates for 30 years for that caliper. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to the Pack River Ridge the next morning. Junebug stood in the open bay of Tucker's red cedar timber frame shop and walked slowly around the Power Wagon 3 times. She ran her hand along the chrome Dodge letters and the heavy military round fender hood. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking timber blaze orange junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Boone and she asked the price. Boone looked at his grandfather. Tucker laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down Highway 200 to Hope and park her in front of the empty log frame lot where Belden Backwoods-recovery stood until October of 1989. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1972. The boy paid $185 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you." They finished the Power Wagon through that winter. Junebug drove up from Coeur d'Alene every other Sunday. On the morning of May the 4th of the 19th year, they rolled the B3 out of Tucker's shop under a clear blue Idaho sky, and they drove her in convoy down US 95 and east on Highway 200 to Hope, and parked her facing the empty log frame lot where Belden Backwoods-recovery had stood. Boone handed Junebug a small can of deep forest green paint and a 1-inch brush. Junebug climbed up on the running board, and she painted out the flaking timber blaze orange junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, "Belden Backwoods-recovery, established 1972. Old enough to drive her without breaking her." She stepped down. A potlatch issue forest green Ford F 350 went by on Highway 200. Buff Crane was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Power Wagon, at the empty log frame lot with the forest green door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The Power Wagon sits on Highway 200 outside Hope today, and the sign on the door reads, "Belden Backwoods-recovery, established 1972. Junebug runs the fly fishing guide service north of Coeur d'Alene Lake. The $1,200 sits in a small lockbox at her guide cabin. The 1937 Potlatch Lumber timber caliper sits beside it. The 1982 photograph is framed on the wall above her tying bench. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year on the 11th of October. If you ever see an old Dodge Power Wagon parked along Highway 200 outside Hope with the words Belden Backwoods-recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down, roll the window down, and listen. There is a story in that truck that a potlatch camp boss would have hauled to Lewiston for the cost of the diesel. And the work was always for the girl. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.